First of all, let me applaud you for being here on a Saturday at 6 p.m. We wanted to make this afternoon a bit better with some drinks and food at the end, so I hope you can enjoy that as well. I'm basically here to talk to you about a very specific project we're developing at the Environmental Law Center together with our regional office in South America, our regional office in Eastern Africa, and our country office in Vietnam. We have one of the representatives here tonight with us. So this project is basically on spatial planning. Before I start talking about the project, I just wanted to present very briefly this scheme, which basically to me is very, let's say, instrumental to understand why spatial planning is important. So whenever you're making decisions about a land use, you tend to encounter yourself with social issues, environmental issues, and economic issues. So to me, spatial planning legal frameworks are actually crucial to create the institutional arrangements, the platforms where you will make the negotiations and the hard decisions you need to make between the institutions, the key stakeholders. So that's why I think spatial planning is crucial for let's say, finding the right decisions to achieve what, at the end of the day, is sustainable development. How is this linked to the Aichi targets? Well, just briefly, and I'm mentioning only two of the Aichi targets, Aichi Target 2 and Aichi Target 11, because they make a specific reference to spatial planning. So in Aichi Target number 2, specifically talks about planning processes, and Aichi Target 11, as some mentioned here, is not only about achieving specific goals of coverage, but also about achieving connectivity. And that's where spatial planning comes into play, to achieve that connectivity. I think you could make the case that spatial planning could be instrumental not only for these two targets, but for several of the targets. There are other instruments that actually mention spatial planning issues, so this is not only relevant for the CBD Convention and the corresponding Aichi targets, it's also specifically mentioned in the Convention on Climate Change, in the Convention of Ramsar, UNESCO World Heritage Convention, and this is just to cite a few examples of the importance of this sort of legal frameworks in the international scenery. Specifically, this project is aiming to promote biodiversity conservation and climate change considerations into spatial planning frameworks. And there is let's say, a participatory component to that process. So we're trying to achieve this by including also the stakeholders that are being directly affected by spatial planning decisions. So the project basically, and before I go into the next slide, we're working right now in Vietnam, Colombia, Zambia, and Tanzania. So we are basically have these pilot projects where we are contributing in their spatial planning exercises. And apart from that, we're carrying out a legal study of 15 countries so that we can assess how countries in Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia are dealing with environmental concerns through spatial planning tools and spatial plans, basically. So what's the basic methodology of this project? So we developed a three-step approach. So the first phase is basically generating the knowledge. So we're carrying out first the legal studies. We need to understand what the legal frameworks are. Second, we are contributing to generate some technical information, for example, on ecosystem service valuation, what are the trade-offs, the economic trade-offs of one land use or the other. We're generating technical information on and climate change resilience. So the idea is that once you have generated all this information, particularly in the pilot countries, then we will feed that information into the spatial planning processes so that biodiversity and climate change aspects are incorporated into those plans. The second phase is generating consensus, because once you have the information, then you can make better informed decisions. So the idea is to generate a consensus around these areas with the authorities that are in charge of making the spatial planning decisions. And the third component of this is actually disseminating key messages. So the idea is to generate information locally that will be then taken not only at the national level but also at the international level. And on top of that, the idea is to capture main messages of spatial planning from those 15 legal studies. So what sort of information are we looking at in the legal assessments? We want to understand what type of plans are there in these countries. Are we talking about national plans? Are we talking about local plans? Are we talking about marine spatial plans? Are we talking about rural or urban plans? So every country has its specificities, and we want to understand what are the, let's say, benefits and costs of one or another approach. We want to understand the process itself. So what kind of coordination platforms do you have between institutions, local institutions and national institutions for coming up with these plans? What sort of information is, let's say, feeded into these processes so that you are making informed decisions? We want to know, for example, in the context of protected areas, if you have any specific legislation on buffer zones, so that the areas around protected areas are less, so that the land uses of those areas around protected areas do not impact the protected areas. We want to understand the zoning regulations, what kind of monitoring regulations do you have in that regard, public participation and access to information. So are the communities and the owners of the land or the tenants of the lands, how are they being informed about this land use process? Do they have a voice in these decisions? So we want to understand that. What kind of access to justice do you have if, for example, a community wants to have a say regarding a specific area of biological importance, or if I, as a tenant or owner of a land, am being affected by a specific spatial plan, do I have any say in that decision? So we want to understand that those mechanisms as well. So basically that's in a nutshell, because let's say this is a very brief outline. It's obviously much more specific. But now I would like to give the floor to our representative from our country office in Vietnam, so he can give you more, let's say, information about what's actually happening in one of these countries, which is Vietnam in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Santiago. My name is Jacob Brunner. I work for IUCN in Hanoi. I supervise IUCN's program in Vietnam, also in Cambodia and in Myanmar. And I must say, pretty well everything that's been discussed so far this evening is extremely relevant to all the countries I work in. But I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about the Mekong Delta. There are some facts and figures there, but what I want to do is show you a picture. The Mekong Delta, basically, it's one vast wetland connected hydrologically. And the French recognized this very quickly when they arrived. They colonized at the end of the 19th century, and they started to dig canals to sort of open up the delta for strategic purposes, for commercial purposes. And they quickly realized, the saying in French is "un œuvre de Pénélope." It's work without end. You start to dig in the delta, and then it quickly fills in. It's an extremely dynamic environment. This is a satellite. It's a mosaic of satellite photographs taken in November. The peak flooding area, peak flooding time. Everything in the blue basically is underwater. And this flooding is extremely important for the agricultural productivity because it brings fresh nutrients and it flushes the salt and toxins from the soil. So it maintains the natural productivity of the landscape. And people have lived here for hundreds of years, living essentially in sort of harmony with nature. Flooding, for those who lived in the south, was not a threat. Flooding was life. Now this changed dramatically in the 70s and 80s after reunification. In the 1980s, Vietnam flirted with starvation, not in the south, but in other parts of the country. And rice production, rice self-sufficiency was a top priority. So after reunification, they sent the hydraulic planners from Hanoi, many of whom had been trained in Russia, to the south with instructions basically to replumb, to re-engineer the Mekong Delta, an ambitious target. And they brought with them a new word called Lũ. In Vietnamese, there are many words for floods, but Lũ was from the north, and Lũ was a violent, unpredictable, damaging event that was typical in the Red River, and it was of great historical importance because dynasties often ended with major flood events, because clearly the emperor was no longer communicating with God. He'd lost God's confidence. And so, of course, the focus in the Red River was, as in China, was to prevent floods at all costs. And they brought this mentality down with them. This is a photograph taken actually last May, and it's a sort of fairly typical landscape in the heart of the delta. And what you see is a low dike running left to right. And in Vietnamese, they call this the August dikes. And these are dikes, you can easily walk across, as you see. And they're called August dikes because as the Mekong flood rises, it overtops the dikes in August. And these dikes were basically built to allow 2 crops of rice a year. Now, starting in the early 90s, driven by this concern over food security, the government started a process of intensification, rice intensification. And a key part of this strategy was to move from 2 crops a year to 3 crops a year, in some cases to 4 crops of rice a year. And to do that, you had to sort of isolate large areas hydrologically from the Mekong flood, those large areas of blue that you saw in the previous picture. And they started to build these new dikes, they call them ring dikes. And these were very high. And basically what they did was they cut off the Mekong from the floodplain. And the result was predictable. This is a photograph of flooding that took place exactly 3 years ago, early November 2011. The high dikes broke, and they resulted actually relatively low loss of life, only about 60 people died, but massive damage to property. And for the first time ever, some of the urban industrial centers downstream were flooded, because of course what happened was these high dikes compressed the water and channeled the water downstream. So cities like Cantor, which had never been flooded before, suddenly were underwater, literally. And of course the immediate reaction was climate change. That's sort of the knee-jerk reaction to any kind of environmental disaster, if you like, was climate change. Well, actually, no. The amount of water entering Vietnam from Cambodia was no different from before. What had happened, this was an entirely man-made disaster. Now, no one wanted to talk about this, but a group of academics who had been very concerned about this intensification, led by some of the colleagues who were working with us on this legal planning study in the Delta, did a film, and I wish I could show it. We don't have time, but it's brilliant. And it just exposes, if you like, the human causes of this natural disaster. Now, what this has done is it has provoked a rethinking about whether or not maximizing rice production through a process of hyper-intensification is really the best value, the best use of the Mekong Delta's natural resources. Until a few years ago, this was off the agenda. Sure, it could be discussed in universities in private, but it couldn't be spoken about publicly. And with the support of this project now, this is now being put, if you like, into the public domain. And very difficult questions are being asked. And we are now working, one of the complications of working in the Mekong Delta is that although it is one single hydrological unit, it's split up into 13 separate provinces, all of whom are furiously competing to produce more rice or whatever to achieve the targets that the Prime Minister has set. You know, somehow or other they always just about achieve it, but what's becoming clear is it's coming at enormous environmental, economic and social costs. And for the first time, these costs are now being made explicit. People are questioning, if you like, the value of this sort of rice at all cost policy. It's resulted in parts of the Delta in the collapse of communal fisheries, which particularly affects the poor. It's resulted in increased saline intrusion in the coastal areas. It's resulted in the production of tons of rice that basically can only be sold to a few countries through government-to-government contracts. It goes to Cuba and to Venezuela and a few other places. So basically this project is trying to provide the scientific and legal foundations, if you like, for a reversal of this rice at all costs policy, and essentially to promote a more natural hydrology and land use in this delta for multiple benefits. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful and brief presentation. I'd love to hear you for an hour on all of this. It's very important stuff. And this project, I think Santiago is such an important one in terms of bringing all of this together and interacting between science and law in order to come up with some sensible legal frameworks and the policy drivers.